Greetings from Mountain Dowsville Missionary Baptist Church. My name is Jimmy Dale, and I'm making this video. Hopefully it'll be a blessing to our church and community here. It's about our community and what we can do to reach out to our community. The title of this presentation is called Reaching the Religiously Unaffiliated with the Resurrection of Jesus. There is a growing concern over what's happening to our young people who are leaving the church over the lack of response to our evangelistic efforts in our community. A recent demographic study suggests that our community has changed from being a people who were more hospitable to the claims of the gospel to a people who are very skeptical. The purpose of this project is to protect our body of believers from the influence of worldly thinking, that our witness may be more effective in our community. So it's about outreach into our community here in Eureka. This study of our community says that the religiously unaffiliated is the largest demographic group in our community, which comes as a shock because most of us think of our community as a very religious community. The nuns, so there you see the demographic where it says 75% of folks that are in our community, that's within 5-mile radius of our church, 75% of those have no affiliation with any religious group at all. So this comes as a shock to us. The nuns are a demographic group within society who identify themselves as being unaffiliated with any religious group. Their lifestyle is materialistically focused and guided by naturalism. I believe that preaching about the resurrection of Jesus can challenge the influence of naturalism by demonstrating that it does not accurately describe reality. Since there is credible evidence that supports the belief that the resurrection of Jesus Christ did occur, then this can be an effective means of exposing it as a flawed worldview. The goal of this project is to get people thinking about the evidence for themselves. If the resurrection is true, then it at least confirms that naturalism cannot be true. See, the challenge of naturalism. Naturalism is a challenge. Naturalism is a challenge to our church by frustrating our evangelism efforts and by corrupting our beliefs. We receive the influence of naturalism through several mediums, like in the media, like various forms of entertainment, and even in our educational systems. This influence has had an impact on our community and it can be seen in the increased numbers of those who no longer associate themselves with any religion. Ryan P. Bunge, in his book called The Nuns, describes 3 types of the religiously unaffiliated. There's the atheists, the agnostics, and the nothing in particular. The last group best describes most of the people in our community. Most have simply walked away from any involvement, from involvement in any church, and are apathetic, especially towards organized religion. I believe that most of the people in our area still do believe in God, even as this atheistic philosophy is having influence in their lives, which is why I believe a discussion about the resurrection can be effective. The goal is to find a way to reach these people with the gospel. Just as with any group, they have needs that the church can address to get their attention, to share the gospel with them. But naturalism is a barrier that inhibits their ability to understand the message of the gospel. I believe Paul would call it a stronghold that needs to be destroyed. He says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ." Naturalism rejects the belief in God. Therefore, it excludes God from the way a person thinks about life. The resurrection of Jesus is an event that demonstrates that it is not true. Naturalism also affects Christians by causing confusion about the nature of God, his revelation, and his work. The liberal theology that has affected so many of our churches is a fruit of naturalism. Despite a confession of belief in God, they reject the supernatural elements in Scripture. Liberalism views the Bible primarily as a man book instead of a revelation from God. For example, the first 11 chapters are mostly myths told to explain human origins. The miracles recorded in the Gospels are legends that are added to bolster the claims that Jesus was the Christ. This corruption in theology distorts the gospel message and removes protective barriers against evil influences from the community. No one wants to be seen as ignorant or out of touch. The bold proclamation of the apostles. Peter preaches on the day of Pentecost. This Jesus God has raised up, of which we are all witnesses. This bold proclamation is a contrast to the culture because the culture is rejecting God and embracing naturalism. Naturalism is a belief that says we live in a closed system. All that we see is all that there is, meaning there's no God. Evolution is offered to explain life. Miracles are not possible because the universe operates on fixed laws that do not change. According to this belief, prayer is useless and a waste of time. Richard Dawkins mocks prayer. He refers to a study published in the American Journal, which concluded intercessory prayer itself had no effect on complication-free recovery from CABG, but certainty of receiving intercessory prayer was associated with a higher incidence of complications. But even in reading his description of the experiment, this study should not be considered as scientific because there are too many uncontrollable variables. Are those who are praying qualified to pray? Do they know how to pray? What exactly are they praying? James chapter 5 says, the effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. The point here is that Dawkins uses this to question the existence of God and the truthfulness of Christianity. The objective for us, though, here is to prepare our young people to meet this kind of challenge. The apostolic preaching about the resurrection of Jesus confronts culture. But if it is true, then naturalism cannot be true. Reasonable expectations. As we begin this investigation to the resurrection of Jesus, it's important that we recognize that there are some limitations to what can be established. There are limits to being able to establish the truth of something being so far removed from the event itself. For example, I cannot demonstrate that Aristotle existed, but I do not have any doubt that he did exist. We should not expect to be able to validate every detail in the gospel stories. That is impossible. Bart Ehrman uses a few details that cannot be confirmed to imply that the whole account cannot be trusted. In Mark chapter 15, verse 16, the text says, Pilate was accustomed to releasing a prisoner. But Dr. Ehrman says that he cannot find a reference to this custom. Therefore, he questions the whole account. But issues like this should be of no concern because there are several reasons that could explain this. He also mentions the ripping of the veil in the temple. But again, this does not mean the account is not true. It just means they can't validate that one point. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It's just that being so far removed in distance of time, the evidence for that particular event may have been lost due to the nature of things. The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus does not prove there is a God, or that it was God as described in the Bible that raised him from the dead. But if the resurrection is true, then naturalism is not. The objective here is to use the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus to raise the issue that maybe there is a God. If there is no God, then miracles are not possible. But if the evidence indicates that a miracle did occur, therefore, it is the premise that there is no God is what needs to be examined. Additional arguments need to be made to establish these separate points. But this trail of evidence can lead to a needed conversation about whether there is a God. Another limitation that we should understand in doing an investigation like this has to do with the nature of the evidence itself. We are somewhat removed from the event by time and space, but the disciples were eyewitnesses. John says that we've looked upon, our hands have handled concerning the word of life. We are not able to see, hear, and touch as they did, but there is sufficient evidence to establish a belief beyond reasonable doubt. There is direct evidence in the historical record, and there is indirect evidence to validate that the record is true. Therefore, it is reasonable to conclude that they are true. Some have criticized, saying that the claims about the supernatural events require extraordinary evidence, but others to say they will only believe what can be proven by science. These statements imply a misunderstanding of the nature of things. Most of what we know about ancient history comes to us through a written record. And to exclude a record of an event because of a bias that itself cannot be validated is foolish. Science limits itself to the physical world. Therefore, it is not capable of testing something that is not physical. There are many things that cannot be proven by science, but we still know that they're real. Morality is a real thing, but it is not subject to the scientific method. J.P. Moreland lists 5 things that science cannot prove. Science cannot explain the origin of the universe. Science cannot explain the origin of the fundamental laws of the universe. Science cannot explain the fine-tuning of the universe. Science cannot explain the origin of consciousness. Science cannot explain the existence of moral, rational, and aesthetic objective laws and intrinsically valuable properties. In addition, what may be considered as extraordinary evidence to one person may not be extraordinary evidence to another person. See, this is very subjective and not scientific. The historical record. The Gospels, which are 4 different accounts, contain direct evidence of what happened with the resurrection of Jesus. And they all agree with the basic details of the story. Their differences are of no concern because they each write from a unique perspective. Luke was a doctor and historian. Matthew was a tax collector. Mark's account was more personal, while John's was more theological. In my study, I have several biographies on Abraham Lincoln. They differ in length, in the details, and in their emphasis, but together they give a fuller picture of what Abraham Lincoln was actually like. The Gospels agree that Jesus was crucified. The soldiers verified his death. Joseph of Arimathea received his body and buried him in his tomb. Mary Magdalene was the first to come to the tomb and saw that it was empty. That a young man or angel told Mary that Jesus had risen. In addition, Paul adds that he also saw Jesus alive. The differences in the stories are not significant, and they do not exclude each other. For example, Matthew says it was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. But John reports that only Mary Magdalene. But John's report does not exclude the other Mary. Now, if he had said that only Mary Magdalene came to the tomb that morning, that would be a contradiction in their stories. In J. Warner Wallace's book, Cold Case Christianity, he gives several questions to ask the gospel witnesses to evaluate their credibility. First, were they there? Were the disciples able to see what happened for themselves? The answer is yes. They were with Jesus when he was arrested. They witnessed the crucifixion. He appeared to them as individuals and as a group on more than one occasion. When they explained what happened, they were able to do so from their own perspective. Second, have they been honest and accurate? The answer is yes. There is no reason to think that they would not have been honest. There's nothing to gain. There's nothing for them to gain by lying about what happened. Their descriptions are different, but not contradictory. If they were exactly the same, people would know that they had concluded with one another to get the story right. Third, can their stories be verified? Yes, their stories can be verified. They give accurate descriptions about the various locations. Their language fits the culture. The names of the officials are correct. For example, Norman Geisler summarizes the research of the famous British archaeologist William Ramsay. His conclusion was that in references to 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands, Luke makes no mistake. That is a record to be envied by historians of any period. There is also indirect evidence from various sources outside of biblical literature that confirm their testimonies and the details of Jesus' life and ministry. Josh McDowell, in The Evidence That Demands a Verdict, provides a list of sources like Tacitus, who says that Pilate had Jesus crucified; Josephus, who also says that Pilate had Jesus crucified; and his disciples believe he appeared to them after his death. He also mentions, McDowell also mentions, that there is a notation in the Talmud saying Jesus was hanged on the eve of Passover. Fourth, do they have ulterior motives? There's no reason for the disciples to lie about what they saw and experienced. There was nothing to gain by doing so. In fact, they put themselves at risk by continuing to share their testimonies. They were threatened by the Sanhedrin. Stephen was stoned. They were all persecuted. Many, or almost all of them, were martyred. To be labeled a Christian in the first century put a person at risk. Look at how Nero responds to the spread of Christianity. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, that's reference to the cross, during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, that's a reference to the resurrection, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful come from every part of the world, find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much for the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths and they were covered with the skins of beasts. They were torn by dogs and perished, were nailed to crosses, were doomed to the flames and burned, to serve as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. The point here is that there's no reason for the disciples to lie about their testimony. Their motivation for sharing their testimony was their love for Jesus and for their fellow man. Jesus had commanded the disciples to spread his message. Tell everyone about the good news. Paul explains his motivation this way. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. And to those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, I was without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak, I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. In the next paragraph, in his challenge to the believers in Corinth, he explains there is a spiritual blessing for being faithful. The primary reason for objecting to the gospel accounts of Jesus, of the resurrection of Jesus, is because it is a supernatural event. In other words, the natural course of things was interrupted by an act of God that otherwise could not have happened without his intervention. Today's use of the word miracle has lost its significance. There are several theories offered to explain the resurrection in more naturalistic terms, but they all conflict with the facts in some way. Josh McDowell lists 4 of those theories. The swoon theory. This holds that Jesus was not actually dead when he was taken down from the cross. The soldiers and disciples were mistaken. He only appeared to be dead. When he did revive, he was able to move the tomb out from front of the stone, or the tomb himself, and walk out, and later appeared to his disciples. The problem with this explanation is that it assumes that Jesus could have recovered from his wounds. But the amount of blood loss, the tissue damage, and the infection would have occurred all make this seem implausible. The soldiers verified that he was dead before he was taken down. Pilate even asked if he was dead. The next theory, the theft theory, which says that the disciples stole the body. This was the fear of the Jewish leadership. So they went to Pilate to have a guard posted at the tomb, which was granted. It is not reasonable to think that they could have successfully accomplished such a deception. They had nothing to gain by lying, and the lying would have put them at risk, unnecessary risk. The amount of people who would have to participate in the deception make it impossible. They obviously believed he was alive, which was the factor in their transformation. This theory does not explain the transformation of those who were previously hostile to Jesus. The third theory, this is called the hallucination theory. And it says the disciples were overcome with emotion or desire, and they hallucinated and thought they saw Jesus. This conflicts with what they describe. Mary touched his feet. Jesus ate with the disciples, and he was with them in body form. He challenged Thomas to touch his wounds. In addition, hallucinations only happen to individuals and not whole groups. And all the hallucinations vary greatly in details, and they conflict with each other. Fourth, the wrong tomb. The women went to the wrong tomb that morning. However, this would have been a difficult mistake for them to make. You see, they had previously been to the tomb with Joseph of Arimathea when he was being buried. There would have been few tombs like this one. It belonged to a person of distinction. It was in a garden. It was newly cut out of the rock. This mistake does not explain the appearances of Jesus to the disciples or their transformation because of seeing him. It was such a dramatic experience that for them, it completely changed their lives. Peter went from denying that he knew Jesus to boldly defending his belief before the Sanhedrin. It says in the book of Acts, "But Peter and John answered and said to them, 'Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. That's in Acts chapter 4. When Paul is confronted by Jesus on the road to Damascus, he is changed from being one who persecutes Christians to being one who is persecuted. His change was such a shock to the early believers that they were wary of him. The next section, the integrity of the text. The previous section has been about the direct and indirect evidence contained in the gospel record. Now it's time for us to focus on the text itself. Don Stewart and Joseph M. Holden explained there are three issues that need to be understood when understanding the reliability of the New Testament manuscripts. The number of the manuscripts, the dating of the manuscripts, and the accuracy of the manuscripts. It is important to acknowledge that no one possesses the original manuscripts today. Most of the copies available are dated significantly later than the originals. This means that those copies are recopies of recopies several times over. Therefore, the opportunities for corruption increase with time and transmissions. The copies do contain scribal errors, and there are mistakes made in the transmissions. And there are copies that do have significant omissions. For example, the Codex Syntacticus and Codex Vaticanus both admit Matthew 16, 9 through 20, and John 7, 53 through 8, chapter 8, verse 11. They're both missing from early and diverse manuscripts. Bruce Metzger, a New Testament expert, concludes the evidence for the non-John origin of the pericope of the adulteress is overwhelming. As a church, we need to think more apologetically when preparing our curriculum for our youth programs. When we fail to address these issues for our youth, we leave them as prey before false teachers who take advantage of their naivety. Bart Ehrman tells his own story of how he began to lose his faith each time he discovered something was not true about what he had been taught about the Bible. At first it seems heartbreaking, but I want to take issue with this story because I went to a similar school and heard similar statements such as he did. Yet I came to very different conclusions. The lack of the original manuscripts and the scribal errors do not destroy the integrity of the Bible and are not a concern because there are so many manuscripts available. Another New Testament scholar, Craig Bloomberg, states, but this should cause no consternation because we have so much evidence to help us to recognize this, to enable us to make informed guesses as to what happened and why, and to be confident in what the original text said. In other words, the fact that there are so many copies distributed over wide areas and that the errors can be identified and corrected by comparing copies with copies. Dr. Ehrman is a famous New Testament scholar and atheist who has been highly critical of the New Testament reliability, or New Testament's reliability. But even he would agree that we have the original reading in the multiple copies. The disagreements are over which reading is correct or how to interpret that reading. And in fact, he says, indeed, barring extraordinary new discoveries, in other words, finding the autographs, or phenomenal alteration of method, it is virtually inconceivable that the actual physical reading of the printed Greek New Testament is ever going to change. But specifically, in reference to the issue of the resurrection of Jesus, Dr. Ehrman was asked if the textual corruptions had an impact on the resurrection, or of our resurrection, of Jesus' resurrection. Here's the dialogue. Question, Dr. Ehrman, at this point in scholarship, does the earliest reconstructible form of the text betray an orthodox understanding of the resurrection and the deity of Christ? Ehrman, I'm not sure what the orthodox understanding of resurrection is. You mean that Jesus was bodily resurrected from the dead? Question, yeah, that Jesus was resurrected from the dead and that he is both God and man. Ehrman, I do not think that the texts affect those views one way or the other. My own view is that the writers, the biblical writers, authors, thought Jesus was physically resurrected from the dead, but that most of the biblical writers did not think that Jesus was God. The Gospel of John does. I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not think that Jesus was God. It's hard to know what Paul's view about Jesus' divinity is, in my opinion. So I think different authors had different opinion. I do not think in most cases that is affected by textual variation. This dialogue is important because this highlights that the real controversy is over the interpretation of the facts, not over the facts themselves. The integrity of the text is incredibly strong. The key issue people are struggling with when they read their Bibles is how to understand it. The content of the text is basically agreed upon by friend and foe. But the critics say that it should not be considered as historical because of the supernatural elements in the narrations, which is a reasonable reaction for somebody that does not believe in God. Healthy skepticism is a good thing. See, throughout history, there have been people who have used the miraculous to deceive people. Those people should be exposed. What is unique about Jesus, though, is he is the Messiah, the Son of God. He was examined by friend and foe, and his critics found no fault in him. The Gospels are not historical biographies in the sense that we think of a biography today. They are theological arguments with evidence. Both John and Luke make it clear what they're doing. John says, and truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Inasmuch, this is what Luke says, inasmuch as many had taken into hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered to us. It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. They recognized the uniqueness of who Jesus was. He had the legal and the natural right to be king in Israel. He had a love for people. He understood issues in the law that had confounded the experts of the day. The prophecies and sign miracles that were associated with his ministry validate that he is the Son of God. They are extraordinary evidence. They present a reasonable argument for someone who believes in God, but for someone who does not believe in God, it is not reasonable. The value of a conversation about the resurrection highlights the importance of faith in God. That life cannot be explained apart from God. See, this is the premise that needs examination. In conclusion, there is enough evidence to reasonably and confidently conclude that Jesus is alive. Those who are trusting in him for salvation shall be like him in the sense that we will be in our bodies, but not subject to death. Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians 15 rests on the idea that Jesus physically arose from the dead, and he is a first fruit of what we shall be like. I hope this is enough. I believe this is enough to inspire hope in those whose life is characterized by hardship and despair, because there are better days coming when you have hope in Jesus Christ. This project has been to explore one of the factors that I believe is hindering our ability to do outreach in our community and is drawing young people away from church. Naturalism is one of those factors. It is a false doctrine that causes people to doubt the truthfulness of Christianity. By including the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus in our messaging, our sermons, our newsletters, or podcasts, we can at least cause some to examine their own worldview. We can also challenge the influence of liberalism because the evidence of the resurrection affirms that the Bible is true. The resurrection, if it is true, then Jesus is the Son of God. This can lead to a discussion about his work and his word. The resurrection does not prove there is a God, but it should at least cause someone to explore the idea so that they can explain their reality. Obviously, this would be just the beginning of a conversation about the gospel.